They said she was cursed, a woman without a husband, raising 3 daughters alone in a village that measured a woman's worth by the man who stood beside her. Alzer had buried her husband beneath the mango tree behind their clay house. She hadn't cried at the funeral, not because she was strong, but because grief had carved her empty, the kind of emptiness that doesn't scream. It sits silently, watches the world move without you. For months after, the village whispered, "Poor Alzer," they'd murmur. "She won't last long without a man. Who'll protect the girls? Who'll bring home meat? Who'll fix the roof when it caves in?" But Alzer didn't answer them. She rose before dawn, lit her fire, braided her daughter's hair with shaking hands, and learned to do the things her husband used to do. She learned where to place her weight, to split wood. She learned which weeds were safe to cook when money ran low. She even learned to smile at the women who crossed the road when they saw her, as if widowhood were contagious. Her daughters, 3 fragile flowers blooming in a storm, never asked for more than her presence. And every night, when they laid their heads in her lap, she reminded herself, "You haven't lost everything. You are still their home." But loneliness is a cruel thing. It eats slow, like termites in a foundation. And though her spine stayed straight, something inside Alzer sagged a little more with every season. Then he came, Obesai. No one saw him arrive, and no one knew where he came from. One morning, as the sun stretched its first golden fingers across the clay path, Alzer found him asleep beside her broken fence, curled like a wounded animal, with a gash on his leg and silence too deep for a stranger. His clothes were torn, face sunburned, and his breath came in shallow, angry gasps. But his hands, they were large, rough, the hands of a man who had worked, or fought, or both. Her first instinct was fear. A woman alone, 3 daughters, a bleeding man. The world had not been kind enough for her to trust freely. But something stopped her from walking away. Maybe it was the way he clutched the earth beneath him, like someone begging not to float away. Or maybe it was the way her youngest daughter, peering from behind a curtain, whispered, "Mama, he looks like he forgot how to cry." Alzer dragged a bench beside him, poured a gourd of water, and placed it near his hand without saying a word. She did not ask him who he was. She did not ask him what he had done, because a woman who has tasted sorrow doesn't always need a story. She knows pain by its scent. When he woke, his eyes darted like a hunted thing. But when they landed on Alzer's calm face, something inside him stilled. He did not speak for 2 full days. Alzer tended his wound with bitter leaves and silence. The daughters watched from the doorway, curious but unafraid. Perhaps they saw what others could not. A man already broken, not dangerous. A man more afraid of being seen than judged. He began sweeping the yard with one hand while the other clutched his side. When Alzer came home from the forest with firewood, she found the door fixed. He never told her he had done it. He never said thank you, never asked for pity. But when Alzer handed him a plate of yam one evening, he said something so soft she almost missed it. "Why?" She paused. "Why what? Why help a man who doesn't deserve it?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at the stars above them, the same stars she used to count with her husband before sleep came. "Because once I needed help," she said, "and no one came." After that, something shifted. He began speaking more, one memory at a time, not whole stories, just fragments. A brother lost a war, a forest that had once been his refuge, a betrayal too old to forgive. And in return, Alzer told him of her late husband, of how he used to sing when the oil crackled in the pot, of how the mango tree was planted when their first daughter was born, of how, after he died, the bed felt like a cave and the silence like an ocean. 2 rivers, once running in different directions, began to meet. Her daughter started calling him Uncle Obesai. The youngest, afraid of thunder, would curl up beside him during storms. He'd hold her close, whispering tales of fearless hunters and invisible lions that ran from laughter. No promises were spoken, no labels given, but the house felt different. Where there had once been a waiting, now there was a warmth. And the village? It watched, with suspicion, with silence, with gossip, She's letting a stranger live there? She doesn't even know his past. Men like that don't change. But Alzer didn't defend herself. She just swept her yard each morning, eyes steady, heart still mending. And when Obeisai stood beside her, carrying a sack of cassava to the market, she walked a little taller. Not because she needed him to stand, but because it felt good not to walk alone. The old women at the well said it would end badly. The younger women, the ones who still remembered hunger, watched quietly. They didn't speak, but their eyes followed. One evening, as the girls danced barefoot in the yard, and the moon rose heavy with promise, Obeisai turned to Alzer. His voice was low, like someone ashamed to speak something sacred aloud. "I didn't know it was still possible," he said, "to become a man again after so many falls." Alzer didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for his hand, calloused, trembling, unsure, and held it firmly. "Here," she said, "we don't ask where you came from. We watch what you plant." That was the moment everything changed. Not because he kissed her. He didn't. Not because she cried. She didn't. But because in that one sentence, there was everything. Forgiveness, faith, and the kind of hope that dares to bloom where the soil is cracked and dry. She had once prayed, silently, for someone to carry some of the weight. But what came was something more. Someone who carried his own and still offered to lift hers. And Obeisai? The world had denied him belonging for so long. He had stopped hoping for it. But here, in a home built of clay and courage, among giggling girls and a woman who didn't flinch at his past, he found something he thought he had lost forever, the chance to begin again. And so the story of Alzer and Obeisai didn't begin with love. It began with wounds, with silence, with a plate of yam and an open door. But sometimes those are the stories that grow the strongest roots, especially when planted in soil watered by tears. The skies had been heavy since morning, as if the earth itself had something to mourn. The clouds hung low, sagging under the weight of something unspoken. The birds were quieter than usual. The air felt dense, and even the animals seemed to sense that something was about to unfold. Obeisai, still bearing the wounds of his past, both visible and buried deep within, stood by the door that morning, watching the trees sway under the rising wind. He wasn't just thinking about the forest. He was thinking about the girls, the daughters who now, without hesitation, called him uncle, the little one who had curled up beside him when the thunder roared at night, the middle child with the quiet smile, the eldest, already showing signs of the woman she would one day become. He needed to do something, not out of obligation, but out of honor. He wanted to give back, to show in action what his words couldn't yet carry. So he grabbed his old machete, slung a bundle of rope across his shoulder, and prepared to head out for a hunt. A gift, a gesture, a declaration that he wasn't just passing through, he was staying. Alza, watching him tighten the straps, felt a weight in her chest. "You don't have to go today," she said. "The rain is coming down harder than usual." Obeisai smiled gently, his voice steady. "Trust me, I'll be back before dark." And with that, he disappeared into the forest's waiting arms. But time, as it often does during storms, began to stretch. The sky turned the color of wet ash. Rain poured down with a fury, like the sky was grieving. Thunder slammed against the hills, and the wind lashed at the clay walls of their home. Inside, the girls played with rag dolls, unaware at first of the tightening coil in Alza's chest. But Alza was pacing. Every rumble of thunder echoed in her bones. Every howl of wind scraped across her nerves. The forest wasn't just trees and soil. It was memory. It was danger. It was the unknown. And Obeisai had walked straight into it. When the last sliver of sunlight began to fade, and he still hadn't returned, something in her snapped. It wasn't panic. It was something older, something deeper. A scream without sound. A fire lit by loss. She slipped on her sandals, grabbed a lantern, and stepped into the storm. No weapon, no companion, just a name carved into her chest like a compass. Obeisai. This wasn't bravery for show. It was survival in motion. It was a kind of courage only mothers, widows, and women with nothing left to lose could summon. The trail was a treacherous mess. Mud sucked at her feet. Branches clawed at her arms. The rain didn't stop. It only grew heavier. But she didn't pause. She called out his name, first loudly, then in whispers, and finally only with her eyes. The forest answered with silence. Until it didn't. A clearing opened up ahead, and there, her heart stopped. Old Bossy was collapsed in the mud. An iron trap had clamped around his leg. Blood pooled and mixed with the soil. His eyes were open, wide with pain and disbelief. But more than that, surprise. Surprise that she had come. Alza didn't think. She ran to him, knees hitting the mud with force, hands flying to the trap. She pulled with everything she had, tears pouring down her face as fiercely as the rain above them. I already lost one man, she shouted to the trees, to the storm, to the God she believed had not abandoned her. Not this one. Old Bossy tried to stop her, his voice hoarse. You'll hurt yourself. But she didn't hear it. Or maybe she did and ignored it. With a bronze for leverage and fury in her soul, she pried the trap open with a final, guttural cry. Old Bossy passed out from the pain. And then, impossibly, Alza did what no one in the village would have believed. She lifted his unconscious body, heavy, broken, blooded, onto her shoulders. The same shoulders that had carried 3 daughters, grief, hunger, shame, and gossip now carried a man through the storm. The journey back was war. She slipped, fell, got back up. Her dress tore. Her arms bled. Her feet screamed. His blood soaked into her skin. But she didn't stop. Not once. The woman the village had pitied, whispered about, written off as a helpless widow, was now blazing through the storm like a myth made real. When she emerged from the trees and into the village's flickering lights, people froze. Some gasped. Some stood motionless. Some looked away in shame. She asked for nothing, said nothing. She just walked, head held high, heart burning like a forge. She laid Obasi gently on the straw mat in their home, cleaned his wounds, and burned the blooded clothes in the yard. The daughters didn't cry. They helped in silence, because they understood this wasn't just a rescue. It was a resurrection. That night, fever claimed Obasi. Alza never left his side. She changed compresses, whispered old proverbs passed down by women who had survived worse. Those who save a life carry scars of honor. A woman who loves with courage heals what the world forgot to protect. She wasn't saying it for him. She was saying it for herself. To remind her own heart that this was not weakness. This was her rising. And rise she did. Obasa survived. His fever broke 2 days later. But the village? The village was never the same. Gossip turned into reverent silence. Judgment melted into awe. Men who once chuckled at her in the square now looked away in shame. Women greeted her with quiet nods, no longer as a widow, but as something entirely different. Something too large for pity, too real for dismissal. And the daughters? They looked at their mother like you look at something sacred. Not a miracle out of myth, but one made of blood and bone and clay. Alza hadn't just carried Obasi out of the forest. She had carried herself out of abandonment. And in doing so, she didn't just save a man. She redefined what it meant to be strong. She shattered a silence the village had grown comfortable in. A silence that said, a woman alone is incomplete. A woman without a man is vulnerable. A woman with children is a burden. Alza proved them wrong without shouting, without demanding, without vengeance. She did it by showing up, with mud on her feet, with fire in her chest, with truth in her steps. Early one morning, Obasi opened his eyes. The fever had passed. His pain had dulled. His body, though wounded, was healing. And there she was, Alza, asleep in the chair beside him, still holding his hand. He whispered, "Thank you." She didn't respond, but the faint smile at the corner of her lips said everything. Because love, real love, doesn't always need words. Sometimes it shows up in the mud, in the fire, in the silence of those who refuse to give up on another soul. But as with all changes that shake the earth, not everyone welcomed it. When the dust settled and Obasi began to walk again, when the girls laughed again, when the house breathed again, an old shadow returned. The village chief arrived. Kasango, a man of titles and rules, of old ideas and rusted authority. He knocked on Alza's door with 2 younger men flanking him, not for kindness, not for warmth, to remind her of order. Obasi answered the door, still limping, but standing tall. Kasango didn't greet him, didn't acknowledge him. "We need to speak with Alza." She appeared moments later, wiping her hands on a cotton cloth. Calm, alert, ready. Kasango began with pleasantries wrapped in control. "You are a respected woman. You've raised your daughters well. But there are concerns." He paused, expecting submission. He didn't get it. He gestured toward Obasi. "This man is unknown. An outsider. People are talking. We believe your house is becoming a shelter for trouble." Obasi stepped forward, about to speak. But Alza lifted her hand gently, stopping him. Then she asked, with a kind of calm only long pain can teach, "What solution are you offering?" Kasango stepped in closer. "We can offer protection. For you. For your daughters. But for that, he needs to go. To preserve order. Reputation." A silence settled. The kind that pressed against your ribs. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then Alza spoke. Her voice didn't rise. But it didn't have to. "Protection from those who can't even care for their own homes is of no use to me." It hit like thunder. The chief's color drained. The young men looked away. "You're refusing the advice of the village elder?" he asked. "I'm refusing impositions," she replied. And then, her final blow. "This man you call stranger? He's the only one who walked into the forest to save my daughter. While others spoke of protection, he swept my yard and fixed my door. He showed up when it mattered." The daughters had crept closer, listening, learning, and when Alza finished, she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was planting something in every soul watching. Kasango tried to reply, but his voice had lost its power, and as he turned to leave, he saw them, the women of the village, standing in the distance. One nodded, another crossed her arms. None spoke, but their eyes said everything. That night, Obasi held Alza's hand and whispered, "You didn't have to do that." She looked him in the eye and said, "I did, because my daughters need to see a woman stand, not a shadow bow." And with that, something ancient cracked, not just in the village, but in the world. The rain came early that morning, uncalled for and uninvited, yet determined, relentless. The sky wore gray like mourning cloth, and the air was thick with a scent only the earth knows when it senses something is about to shift. Birds grew quiet, and animals stirred uneasily as if even they understood. Today would not unfold gently. Obasi woke before the others, stirred not by noise but by a silent resolve in his chest. The weight of his past still clung to him like soaked fabric, but something else had begun to take root. An urge to give back, not out of guilt anymore, but honor. The girls had started calling him uncle with a purity he didn't know he could still inspire, and in return, he wanted to show up, not just with presence, but with action. He stood at the door, machete at his hip, a coil of rope slung over his shoulder, eyes calm but sharpened. Alza noticed a storm brewing, and the storm inside him. "You don't need to go," she said gently, yet with that maternal firmness only a woman who has lived through loss can carry. "The rain will be angry today." Obasi looked at her, the corners of his lips slightly curved in a kind of smile that says, "I know. I'll be back before dark," he replied. "Trust me." And just like that, he disappeared into the forest, where memories waited like thorns and ghosts roamed freely among the wet leaves. As the day wore on, the wind turned from whisper to howl. The rain hammered down like fists against a clay roof. Inside, the girls played with wooden dolls, unaware of the battle unfolding in their mother's chest. Alza tried to distract herself with chores, but every tick of the clock tightened a knot in her gut. Each thunderclap seemed to echo her fear louder. By evening, worry turned to dread. The sun retreated behind thick clouds, and the world turned dim far too soon. Still no sign of him. Not a step, not a whistle. Only silence, cruel and suffocating. Without waiting for permission, from reason, from fear, or from the world, Alza grabbed a lantern, slipped on her sandals, and stepped out into the storm. She carried nothing but Obasi's name in her heart, the memory of his eyes, and a kind of courage that grows only in women who have no one left to lose. The path had turned to mud, but her feet didn't hesitate. Thorns scratched her arms. Rain soaked her bones. Still, she called his name, first loud and softer, and then only with her soul. The forest eventually responded. In a clearing, she found him, collapsed, bleeding, caught in a hunter's iron trap that gripped his leg like vengeance. His face, pale with pain but awake, turned slowly toward her. And in those eyes, surprise, not that he was hurt, but that she had come. She fell to her knees in the mud beside him, her hands reaching for the rusted jaws with fury and trembling tenderness. "Not again," she whispered. "I already lost one man. Not this one. Not you." Obeisai groaned, trying to push her away, afraid for her. "You'll get hurt." "I don't care," she growled. With a branch, she forced the trap open, her body heaving, her soul aflame. With a violent snap, the iron gave in. Obeisai passed out, the pain overtaking him, his body crumpling like broken wheat. What came next wasn't strength. It was something deeper. Alzer, the widow they once called fragile, lifted his weight onto her back and began the long walk home. Every step was a scream. Her feet slipped, her dress tore, her skin bled, but she didn't stop. Not once. When she emerged from the trees, drenched and shaking, with Obeisai on her back like a soldier returning from war, the village paused. Some gasped. Others watched in silence. No one moved to help. They just stared at the woman who defied every expectation and made every judgment seem pitiful. She said nothing. She laid Obeisai on the straw mat, washed his wounds with trembling hands, and burned the cloths in the yard as if cleansing the past. Her daughters watched in quiet awe, their eyes wide, their hearts reshaped by what they had just seen. They understood something unspoken. Their mother wasn't just a survivor. She was a storm wrapped in flesh. That night, fever took hold of Obeisai. His body shook like branches in wind. Alzer didn't sleep. She sat by his side, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, whispering old proverbs like lullabies meant not just for him, but for herself. Those who save a life carry scars of honor. A woman who loves with courage heals what the world never learned to protect. She wasn't trying to sound wise. She was trying to remember that this love, this fierce, blistering devotion, wasn't weakness. It was strength that no man could ever measure. Obeisai survived. The fever broke after 2 long days. But something else had broken, too. The silence, the gossip, the way the village saw her. The men who once laughed at her now looked away, unsure of their own shame. The women greeted her with new reverence. Her daughters stared at her like she was no longer just their mother, but a miracle in motion. She hadn't just carried a man out of the forest. She had carried herself out of another abandonment, and the world noticed. But not everyone admired the change. When old hierarchies tremble, those who built them come looking for the hammer. One morning, under a deceptively peaceful sky, the village chief arrived. Kasango, an elder more feared and respected, known for speaking with the weight of tradition and the arrogance of control. He wore a pale tunic and carried a staff he didn't need. Its only purpose was to remind others he believed he ruled. 2 younger men flanked him, puffed up with borrowed authority. He didn't knock politely. Obeisai, still limping, opened the door. His bandaged leg bore the weight of survival, and though his body was healing, his spirit stood tall. The chief barely looked at him. "We want to speak with Alzer." She appeared, wiping her hands on a cloth, unshaken. Her daughters were in the back, but her presence filled the doorway like an immovable mountain. "We have concerns," Kasango began, rehearsing the tone of someone expecting no interruption. "You've always been a woman of respect, a good mother. But this man," he gestured toward Obeisai with an unspoken sneer, "he is not known to us. And people talk. They say your house is becoming a shelter for outsiders, for trouble." Alzer said nothing. He continued, "So we thought a solution. We can offer protection. For you, for your daughters, but for that, he must leave. You understand? Order must be preserved. A woman alone should not be complicated." The insult hung heavy. The pause afterward was thunder. And then Alzer spoke. Her voice didn't rise, but it cracked something in the air. Protection from those who can't even care for their own homes is of no use to me. Kasango blinked. The young man looked away. "You're refusing the village elder?" he asked, his voice now desperate to reassert itself. "I'm refusing impositions," she said calmly. "This man, who you call a stranger, is the one who entered the forest to save my daughter. While you debated my reputation, he carried her blood in his hands. While you spoke of protection, he swept my yard and fixed my door." Obasai stood behind her, silent, but his eyes burned with something more sacred than pride, belonging. Her daughters had crept closer. They were listening, learning. "And if your order requires I abandon the one person who reached for me when I was drowning," Alzer finished, "then your order does not represent me." Kasango opened his mouth to respond, but the authority had already leaked from him like air from a broken drum. At a distance, a few village women stood watching. One nodded. Another folded her arms. Their silence was not agreement. It was awakening. Kasango turned and walked away, his footsteps slower than when he had arrived. Obasai stepped forward, touched Alzer's hand, placed it on his chest. "You didn't have to do that," he whispered. She answered in a voice steady as earth. "I did, because my daughters needed to see a woman who stands, not a shadow that bows." That night, the village didn't sleep the same, not from fear, but because something old had broken and something stronger had risen. Not revolution. Revelation. Respect wasn't claimed. It was earned. And Alzer had earned it with mud on her feet, fire in her chest, and truth in her hands. From that day forward, people didn't just pass her home, they paused. Not because they were curious, but because they knew something sacred lived there. Something stronger than tradition, stronger than gossip, a quiet force. A woman who once mourned in silence now stood as an example, and a challenge to everything the village thought it understood. The weather turned before anyone had the chance to notice. The skies grumbled with a kind of warning that only those who walked through loss would recognize, a silence before the unraveling. The wind picked up. The clouds gathered thick and heavy, and the rain, when it arrived, came like a reckoning. Obasai had risen early that day, without prompting, without fanfare. He didn't say much, but something in the way he buckled his belt, checked the old machete aside, and slung that worn-out rope over his shoulder told Alzer this wasn't just any hunt. This was something deeper, something like atonement, a way to earn with his actions what he still struggled to believe he deserved. "You don't have to go today," she told him, her voice calm but eyes lined with concern. The storm's already in the air. But he offered that same half-smile, the one that never quite reached his eyes. "Trust me," he replied. "I'll be back before the sky turns." But the sky didn't wait. By midday, the house had grown still. The girls played indoors with their makeshift dolls, laughing, unaware of the storm tightening outside like a noose. But Alzer? She paced. She cleaned the same corner twice. She stirred a pot she'd already turned off, and every rumble of thunder made her flinch like it called her name. By sunset, the absence had become unbearable. Everything. Inside her screamed that something was wrong. With no hesitation, no backup, and no weapon, she grabbed a lantern and stepped out into the trail. There was no time to prepare. Courage doesn't knock when it arrives. It burst through the door. And so she walked, each step a battle against the slick mud, the low branches clawing her arms, the wind screaming that she should turn back. But she didn't. She called his name, first loud, then softer, then only with her breath, her heart. The forest offered nothing back but shadows and the howl of the wind, until the trees parted at clearing, and there her heart stopped. Obasai was on the ground, an iron trap clamped mercilessly around his leg. Blood soaked through his trousers and mixed with the earth like it was trying to vanish him altogether. His eyes were open, but barely, and what she saw in them wasn't just pain. It was disbelief. Disbelief that she had come. Alzer didn't hesitate. She dropped beside him, the lantern toppling into the mud. She tried the trap with her bare hands first, but it wouldn't budge. "I've already lost one man," she cried, fury breaking through the fear. "Not this one too." Obasai groaned. "You'll get hurt." But she wasn't listening. She braced a thick branch against the trap's joint and pressed with her whole weight. Her body trembled. Her arms ached. Her feet sank into the soaked ground. But the trap finally gave, a sharp snap that sent Obasi into unconsciousness. And what she did next would echo across generations. She lifted him, a man twice her weight, limp, bloodied. She slung his arm over her shoulder and began the journey back. Step by painful step, thunder booming above like a curse. She fell. Twice. Her dress tore. Her feet slipped. His blood streaked down her arm like war paint. But she walked. Through every aching joint, every mouthful of rain, every scream of exhaustion, she walked. Not just to save him, but to save something she hadn't dared to believe could exist. The right to love again. When she reached the edge of the village, silence fell. People stepped out from doorways and porches, mouths open, words forgotten. Some reached forward to help, but she said nothing. She walked past them all, mud-covered, soaked to the bone, face set like stone. She laid him on a straw mat, cleaned his wounds, burned the cloths used to stop the bleeding, and whispered prayers between compresses. The girls watched in silence. They didn't ask. They didn't interrupt. They saw. They saw what no sermon or fable could teach, what love really looked like when stripped of words and built on courage. That night, Obasi burned with fever. Alza stayed by his side, eyes red but unflinching, whispering to herself between proverbs. Those who save a life carry the scars of honor. A woman who loves with courage heals what the world forgot how to protect. She wasn't trying to convince anyone, not even him. She was reminding herself that what she had done wasn't weakness. It was power. And when Obasi finally opened his eyes 2 days later, weary but alive, he found her asleep in the chair, still holding his hand. "Thank you," he whispered. She didn't answer, but the small smile at the edge of her lips told him, some things don't need words. From that day on, the village didn't look at her the same. The men who used to laugh in the square when she walked by, they looked away now. The women who used to whisper behind baskets, they nodded when she passed. The daughters, they looked at her like she was a miracle made of bone and breath. She hadn't just carried a man from the forest. She had carried herself out of a sentence the world had handed her years ago. Alone means broken. But now they saw the truth. Alone had become fire. Then came the day the chief returned. His name was Kazango, an old man with slow steps and a faster tongue. He arrived without warning, flanked by 2 younger men like proof of his relevance. He didn't greet Obasi, just knocked and stood like a statue with judgment in his eyes. "We need to speak to Alza," he said. She arrived moments later, wiping her hands on a cloth, alert but calm. "Alza," Kazango began, with false familiarity, "you've always been respected. You've honored your late husband's name, raised your daughter's right. But this man, he is not one of us. The village men are concerned." Alza said nothing. "We offer protection," Kazango continued. "For you, for your girls. But for that to happen, he must go." The quiet that followed made even the birds fall silent. Alza stepped forward, eyes sharp. "Protection for men who can't even protect their own homes?" she asked. "What use is that to me?" One of the young men beside Kazango flinched. The chief stiffened, trying to hold on to his pride. "You would defy the elders' advice." "I'm not refusing advice," she said. "I'm refusing cowardice dressed as order." Then she turned toward Obasi. "This man, the one you call outsider, he went into the forest for my daughter when no one else moved. He has swept this yard, fixed my door, mended what others left broken." The girls had gathered behind her by then, quiet, observant. "If keeping him here means breaking the village's rules," she finished, "then the village's rules never had a place for me to begin with." Kazango didn't answer. He couldn't. Behind him, some women stood at a distance, watching, listening. One crossed her arms. Another nodded once. None of them spoke, but their silence carried thunder. When the chief finally turned and walked away, he knew the truth. His power had cracked. Obasi reached for Alza's hand. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I did," she answered, "because my daughters need to see a woman standing, not a shadow bowed." And that night, something settled across the village like a soft quake. Not fear, not anger. Change. A quiet shift in the soil of tradition. A seed planted. From then on, the house changed again. Not in shape, but in strength. Old Bossy built a table in the corner, crafted shelf from scrap wood, painted a chalkboard from an old plank. "This is where knowledge grows," he said with a smile. And every night, after dinner, he read to the girls. Owls embroidered in silence beside them. But what filled that room wasn't just sound. It was a sound of futures forming. The garden in the back, it grew. Better, stronger, taller. Beans climbed higher, cassava thicker, corn straighter. It was as if the earth, too, knew it was being tended by hands that had known pain, but still chose to nature. Women began stopping by the house. First with small excuses, salt, leaves, but eventually they came to speak. They came to be heard. And Alza never judged. She just poured tea, offered a stool, and listened. Her words were quiet, but they landed deep. Old Bossy didn't impose himself. But he was there, always. Some men approached him for help in the fields, advice for aching knees, tricks for trapping. Slowly, the same mouths that once mocked him began to call him brother. He had never asked to be a leader, but he became something far better. An example. And in the square where only men's voices used to echo, now people paused when Alza spoke. They listened, not because she shouted, but because she didn't need to. The daughters saw it all, and they understood. Strength isn't in noise. It's in presence. Love isn't in gifts. It's in showing up. And a home isn't measured in fences or bricks. It's built from respect and watered with faith. And as the days passed like quiet wind through mango trees, something miraculous happened without anyone announcing it. The once abandoned widow, the once disgraced man, had become the roots of something unshakable. A family, not of blood, but of choice. The rhythm of the village had returned to its usual hum. Children's laughter at dawn. The creaking of carts over dry paths. The smell of roasted cassava drifting from windows. Yet, beneath this ordinary beat, something had shifted forever. It began with a morning no different from the others. Alza stirred the corn porridge over the clay stove while her daughters braided each other's hair, their giggles lighting up the small kitchen. Outside, Obasai worked quietly in the garden, humming a soft melody. The house was still simple, no new walls, no extravagant signs of wealth, but it stood taller now, stronger. Its strength came not from bricks or beams, but from something invisible, something that pulsed through the laughter, the silences, the steady heartbeat of peace. A garden once modest had bloomed defiantly. With Obasai's careful tending and Alza's relentless nurturing, the soil had yielded more than crops. It had grown purpose. Beans climbed higher, corn stood firmer, and the cassava roots came out of the earth thick and healthy. Each harvest seemed to whisper, "You made this. You endured." But the transformation wasn't only in the soil. Inside the home, a corner of the living room had changed too. Obasai, still limping slightly from the healed wound, had built a sturdy table from discarded wood. He fashioned a chalkboard from an old plank and some charcoal, calling it the Tree of Knowledge. At night, after dinner, he would read stories aloud to the girls, stumbling occasionally, laughing with them over mispronounced words. Alza would sit nearby, embroidering, listening with the quiet satisfaction of someone who finally saw her daughters being taught by someone who truly cared. This was no fairy tale. It was something better. Earned joy. The kind forged through fire, loss, and muddy trails walked alone. And people noticed. Women from the village, once silent or suspicious, began to knock on Alza's door. At first with small excuses, a request for salt, a borrowed pot. But soon, their knocks became something else. A quiet plea to be heard. Women abandoned, misunderstood, or judged came seeking something they couldn't name. And Alza, without arrogance, opened her home, offered a bench, a warm drink, a listening ear. She didn't preach. She didn't pretend. She just told her story. And in doing so, she planted seeds of courage, of clarity, in the hearts of others. Obasai never tried to lead, but the men began to come too. One sought advice for knee pain. Another asked how to rig a trap. Some needed help in the fields. They approached him quietly, like people still unsure if humility could wear strength. And old Bayside, always nodding in thanks, answered them the best he could. They stopped seeing him as a stranger. He became something else. A reminder that a man wasn't made by his past, but by how he showed up when no one was watching. The square that once rang with laughter at Alza's expense fell silent when she passed. Heads nodded. Eyes softened. The woman once labeled weak had become something undeniable. Not a leader by title, but a force by truth. Her daughters saw everything. They watched the shift in the world around them and, more importantly, in themselves. They began to study with more focus. They walked taller. They carried their mother's name not as a burden, but as a shield. They had learned that strength isn't noise, it's persistence. That love isn't grand gestures, it's showing up. And that a house, even with cracks in the wall, can be the safest place when its foundation is faith. And then on a sun-warmed afternoon, under the old mango tree, Bayside gathered the girls for a talk. He didn't clear his throat or prepare a speech. He simply looked at each of them, one by one, like they were the most important audience of his life. "I want to ask you something," he said, voice calm but laced with emotion. "Before anything else, I need your yes. I want to marry your mother, but only if you all want it too. This home isn't mine unless your hearts live in it as well." The eldest, wise beyond her years, grinned. "We already see you as part of us." The question was the only thing missing. The middle one, quiet and gentle, placed her hand over his. "If it means seeing Mama this happy every day, then yes." The youngest, too young for long words, too pure to complicate emotion, leapt into his lap and shouted, "Yay!" That same day, Bayside went to Alzer. He carried no bouquet, wore no suit, and didn't kneel. He simply stood in front of her and said, "I don't have poetry. I don't have shiny rings. But I know how to sweep the yard. I know how to stay during storms. I can plant, protect, and show up when it matters. I'm not perfect, but I'm whole. And if you'll have me, I want to share whatever years were given." Alza didn't respond with tears or words. She just smiled slowly, the kind of smile born from healed wounds and rediscovered dreams. "I never had a party," she said, "but I've learned that peace is louder than music." They married a week later. No invitations, no fanfare, just a yard, the daughters with flowers in their hair, and a corn cake on a banana leaf brought by a neighbor. The blessing was whispered by old Gimbo, who spoke more with his weathered hands and with words. "May this union be like a field, hard to keep, but beautiful to harvest." There was no applause, but everyone present felt something shift. It wasn't a wedding, not really. It was a quiet revolution. A woman who had raised 3 daughters alone had found not rescue, but recognition. A man who had been cast out by the world now stood not in shame, but in honor. Together, they weren't just starting a life. They were proving that broken pieces, when joined with care, can form something whole. And then one morning, Bayside stood at the door, a bundle in his hand and a storm of emotion in his chest. "I need to go for a few days," he said. "Just 1 week. There's a place I've been running from for too long. But I'll be back, before the next full moon." Alzer didn't beg him to stay. She simply nodded. Because when you love someone with open hands, you understand that some journeys are meant to be taken alone. The daughters watched him disappear down the trail, his frame small against the horizon. The youngest asked each day, "He's coming back, right?" And Alzer always answered the same way, with a steady voice and a heart full of trust. Anyone who plants with truth always returns to harvest. 7 days passed. On the 7th, just as the sun dipped low and the world turned golden, Bayside returned. His walk was slower, but stronger. He carried 2 things, a worn leather sack and a wooden box with old locks. He had gone back to the village that once cast him out, faced the faces that judged him, sat by his brother's grave. And in that space of reckoning, he accepted the inheritance he once rejected. A small chest of coins, his father's tools, and a forgotten patch of land. "I never wanted anything born from pain," he said to Alzer. "But I've learned. Pain only becomes a curse when we run from it. I claimed it not out of greed, but because now I have someone to give it to." The daughters swarmed him, squealing with joy. The youngest jumped into the small, collapsible boat he brought, laughing like the world had just begun. That night, by the oil lamp's soft glow, Obeisai told stories of the place he came from, of shame and reconciliation, of a past that no longer chained him. And Alzer listened, not with worry, not with doubt, but with peace. Because the truth had bloomed, not in big speeches or public praise, but in evenings around the fire, in dirty fingernails after gardening, in whispered bedtime stories, in trust built slowly like stone upon stone. And as they lay side by side on the same straw mat that once held only her and her daughters, Obeisai took her hand and said, "Now I've found a place where my past no longer weighs me down." She squeezed his fingers gently and replied, "Because here we water the future." There was no dramatic ending, no curtain fall, just a house that stayed lit late into the night, just a family that had planted something deeper than crops, roots, and the village, once blind with judgment, now saw clearly, because they witnessed what love looked like when it showed up muddy, tired, wounded, but willing. They saw what happened when a woman stood tall in a world that told her to shrink. They learned that strength doesn't scream. It endures. And as time passed, the story of Alzer and Obeisai became more than gossip. It became a lesson, a quiet parable passed from porch to porch, from mother to daughter, from father to son, that when you plant with love, water with faith, and tend with kindness, the harvest always comes. Even after the storm, even after the fire, even after the world said you couldn't. Because some stories aren't made for applause. They're made to be lived. And this one, it was lived deeply, by choice, by grace, and by the courage to begin again.